If you are fascinated by the supply chain crisis and curious about how globalization impacts our daily lives, or you're interested in understanding why the world suddenly ran out of everything and inflation got so high, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing How the World Ran Out of Everything by Peter S. Goodman. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at a book that I heard about probably from an NPR podcast. That's where I get a fair amount of my recommendations, probably from The Indicator. They frequently interview authors, and I think this was someone who was on, or wherever I heard it, I was definitely curious by the premise of it, picked it up, and I will say it was certainly an interesting read. Goodman's book is an incisive exploration of the global economy and its how it's interconnected, and also why it is so fragile. It's not just about the logistics of, say, toilet paper shortages or why your favorite items vanished from store shelves, but instead it's a larger, really a critique of the systems behind these issues. In this book, the author takes us on a journey from ports in California to factories in Asia and interviews everyone from truck drivers to executives. And the book really dives deep into how years of efficiency-focused capitalism in particular created a very brittle system that could easily collapse under pressure. And as we saw in recent years, it certainly faced a great deal of strain that did collapse in many regards and had far-reaching consequences, as we saw, particularly starting with the pandemic and then all throughout the pandemic, and in the wake of the pandemic, we saw that continuing. So some of the key moments that Goodman chooses to highlight are going to be stuff like how the pandemic exposed all of these weak links in the global supply chain, but he also ties in decades of policy decisions and corporate strategies that prioritized cost-cutting over resilience. For instance, he looks into how just-in-time manufacturing explains how it's great for cutting costs, but can be terrible for handling unexpected disruptions. As a matter of fact, the whole book follows a particular company who gets most of their sales in the months of November and December, I think December in particular, but because of course for Christmas, and how they had tried to have everything on the shelves at a particular time, but how they were facing roadblock after roadblock in a way that they never had faced before. And I'll let you read the book to find out exactly what happens with that company. But in trying to understand that process, Goodman is telling us what makes the whole system fragile and how the supposed efficiency can also be one of our greatest weaknesses, especially since one thing can have these knock-on effects that can affect the whole system. And I would say that that is really how the book is presented. I mean, there's certainly a question of these massive economic concepts, and I think he does a great job at bringing them to life through some pretty relatable anecdotes. I mean, there's a chapter about a trucker named Eric who is caught in the middle of all of these global issues, and reading Eric's story, I find Eric to be a really interesting character. Or as you're learning about him, you know, there is not just this element of a humanized Eric, but also just a lot of the problems that are in place and how the shortages in the supply chain suddenly make that all the more visible and all the more difficult for people that are involved in the supply chain. Of course, as a truck driver, you could see how he's very directly involved, but people that may not even fully appreciate or understand how involved they are in the supply chain of everything. I would say the book does a great job at mingling those two. I think sometimes the desire to include that human element and to tell a very personal story. Like I said, you are from the very beginning tracing a particular company that is trying to understand why they can't get this really important product on the shelf by Christmas time, you know, also following Eric and all of that. It's certainly adding that human element, but sometimes in some books that I've read of this nature, I feel like they put a little too much emphasis on that and don't actually give you enough of the overarching story. This book certainly does that. This book spends at least as much time, if not more, actually trying to get you to understand the larger macroeconomic and other forces at play that are being taken into consideration for why exactly things are happening the way they are, and why many of the problems in the system are actually deliberate, not necessarily to be problematic, but because it led to either some kind of efficiency or because it just changed the needs of what a company would have to focus on. So that is certainly something that I really valued in this book. I don't have too much else to give you about the explanation. I think that's giving you the premise pretty well. If you are curious about that question of fragility and the whole pipeline and supply chain and all of that, this book has it, and it's definitely something worth reading. I will say, in addition to having that and these really personal anecdotes, he also puts a great deal of emphasis on understanding the politics and the political systems that have helped to create it. You can guess where that's going to start in the 80s, most notably President Reagan, although also Margaret Thatcher and a lot of world leaders at the time, that you see this moment of the decline in the power of the unions. You are seeing this focus on deregulation and on the privatization of a lot of public goods. All of those things are going to play a part in what makes for what appears to be a much more efficient system, but also a much more fragile system, because it simply lacks the heft of larger government systems to also ensure and put in safeties. And that is a big part of this book. I will say that his politics are pretty straightforward, especially of the Reagan administration and his interpretation of what the effects of those moments of privatization and deregulation have caused in the American economy, but also in the world economy. So who is this book for? Well, it's for someone that is interested in the whole story. So you should probably have some interest in the pandemic specific element of it and why exactly everything got so messed up during the pandemic and afterwards. I think that is a pretty important part, that if you want to appreciate this book, that is going to have to appeal to you. But you also are going to want to need to have an interest in the larger and much longer time frame of what has caused the world to have the type of supply system that it has, and especially that relationship between, say, China and the United States, but also between the United States and really any of its major suppliers and manufacturers. And on top of that, these questions of what the roles of stuff like privatization and unions should be in an economy. That is all certainly going to be part of this book, and you should have some understanding, if not necessarily an appreciation or an agreement with, but at least some background information to really appreciate this book. And you're probably not going to appreciate very much if you have any qualms with this discussion of late stage capitalism and the consequences of the major deregulation movements that took place in the 80s. Who is it not for? Well, if that sounds really boring to you, then, well, this book might not be for you. I do think he does a great job at adding that human and personal element, but you're still, in the end, you're talking about the logistics of macroeconomics and choices that were made by politicians that have led to a significant decrease in manufacturing jobs in the United States. And maybe that just doesn't appeal to you. I don't know, but I would say that you probably aren't going to appreciate this book if that is something you don't agree with, or you have a completely different interpretation of. I would say he's somewhat heavy-handed in his approach, but I by and large agreed with most of what he said, and I certainly could see the through line of most of the things that he mentioned. It was never like an obscure event that he pointed to. He generally pointed to large and well understood events, and so taking that and trying to understand its repercussions was a lot easier than trying to just point to like a single obscure fact or act that may have happened some time ago. And I think that does give him a fair amount of credibility, despite the fact that you may not entirely agree with his assessment of the 1980s and its knock-on effects in the American economy, and of course in the larger world economy, and the various political systems. Of course, I'd really like to know what you guys think about this book. Please let me know in the comments what you thought about Goodman's premise and your perception and exactly what his takeaway is about the structuring of the American economy. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.